Hello and welcome to Brass Reflections. Thanks for joining us. Who'd have ever thought we'd get to episode 25? Conceived as an idea at the beginning of lockdown as a way of maintaining the continuity of our weekly band rehearsal, Brass Reflections has become more than we ever anticipated. To date we've received nearly 10,500 YouTube views and the series has generated messages and feedback from all around the Salvation Army world. As you can well imagine, putting these episodes together each week takes quite a bit of production time. So now, as restrictions ease and with less time available to devote to planning and creating the content, we've decided to make a change to our current weekly release schedule. In order to maintain the quality, going forward, we will move Brass Reflections to a monthly edition, which will go live on the CAMSA channel at the same time on the first Tuesday of each month. So, to avoid missing our next episode, which will premiere at 8 PM on Tuesday the 6th of October, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Then you'll receive notifications every time a new video is launched. Anyway, back to this instalment. I'm delighted to welcome Peter, our church administrator, who in recent months has been a key member of our community response team. Here he is just now to share his thoughts around the classic Salvation Army march Rosehill and to talk about his very personal connection with the composer, Colonel Albert Jakeway.
When the bandmaster asked me to think about presenting on Brass Reflections, the hardest part was to select a piece of music. There are many great army composers, there are many great pieces of music from marches to selections, tone poems, and the list goes on. I've always loved music and enjoy a wide variety of genre. There are so many army pieces that really touch my heart, and in some of the more moving pieces, as strange as it might sound, I can feel the Lord sitting next to me, probably telling me where the wrong notes were. So having given this a lot of thought, I finally made this decision to share possibly one of the most well-known marches in the Salvation Army and beyond, and it is Rosehill, composed by Colonel Albert Jakeway, and a bit about the composer himself. The Colonel went to training college in 1914 to become a Salvation Army officer, and he developed as a musician through playing cornet and euphonium within corps bands. In 1926 he was transferred to the music editorial department, as it was in those days, and also became a member of the International Staff Band on B-flat bass. During a period of 9 years he was the bandmaster of Rosehill Band, with whom he made many recordings and broadcasts. He later directed a number of significant Salvation Army bands and also served time in Czechoslovakia. The Colonel composed the march Rosehill, which was named after the premises that were occupied by the Salvation Army's Assurance Society were evacuated during the Second World War. When I was brought into this world in the late 1950s, the march, Rosehill and Colonel Jakeway were both well established and well known within the Salvation Army. I was born into a Salvationist family. My dad played the cornet in the Clapton Congress Hall Band. This was the old Congress Hall building for those mature enough to remember. My earliest memories of growing up around Salvations was probably when I was about 5 years old at Congress Hall, and my dad was friends with Colonel Jakeway, who had retired by then and was living in Leighton, but soldiered at Clapton Congress Hall. My dad had known the Colonel for some years, and as I grew up I just knew him as the Colonel, being young, not realising how famous he was within Salvation Army and banding circles. As far as I was concerned, the Colonel was a friend of my dad, and also, of course, I used to see him every Sunday. Well, my dad started taking me and my brother to watch Leighton Orient. Not sure when, but when I was about 7 or 8. We used to stand on the North Terrace behind the goal, and we used to meet Dad's friend there, the Colonel. I suspect not too many people knew the Colonel was an Orient supporter, and then I'd see the Colonel again on Sunday. The old Congress Hall was closed and we moved to a brand new building just up the road, but of course the Colonel came along too. And when I started secondary school aged 11, one of the first things I did was to sign up for trumpet lessons, and in my first lesson I arrived at the door very nervous, with a beaten up trumpet cornet allocated to me by the school. I knocked on the door and I waited for the teacher to tell me to come in. I heard a voice say, "Come in," and I opened the door and entered. What a surprise, my teacher was Colonel Jakeway. I had no idea, and nor did he, and nothing was planned. It just so happened that in retirement the Colonel was teaching at various local schools, and lo and behold, the Colonel was my teacher. The Colonel was just as surprised. Well, the Colonel took me through my grades with weekly lessons, and it seemed a little strange that during the week of my lessons I addressed him as Sir. All the teachers were addressed as Sir. And then on Sundays, when I saw him again, it was Colonel. The Colonel never let up each Sunday, and he used to ask me, "Have you been practising?" Also at the age of 11, I was auditioned and selected for singing and acting roles within the Royal Opera House Covent Garden in a variety of operas. I was actually Dame Joan Sutherland's son in the production of Norma, and the apprentice in Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, with the main role played by John Vickers. I also sang with Maria Callas, Tito Gobbi, yes, that is a name for the younger generation. That was in Othello, and was also on a recording under Sir John Barbarelli. Yep, that's another name. I was also privileged to go on a tour with the Opera House in Berlin and Munich for a month. One of our conductors was George Shorty. He spent time with us youngsters, telling us how he wanted us to be singing when he was conducting. This all took some time out, and meant with rehearsals and performances I was not always able to make weekly trumpet lessons. Although the Colonel was not overly happy with this, he did understand, but you must practice. My dad was fairly well known within banders circles, and I had another friend called Harry Dilley, who had played in various Salvation Army bands, including the SP&S Band, which of course the Colonel had a strong relationship. Harry had been in the military, and when he finished, he became principal trumpet at the Royal Opera House Covent Garden. My dad told me to introduce myself and to say hello to Harry, which I did, and we used to chat about Salvation Army bands, and people of course, and I also told him that the Colonel was teaching me trumpet. In one lesson with the Colonel, he was not overly very happy with me, as I'd missed a couple of lessons due to rehearsals and performances. I mentioned that I'd met Harry Dilley, and I told him that the Colonel was teaching me trumpet, and Harry was interested, and he said to say hello to you, sir. Although it didn't really change the Colonel's views much on missing lessons, it did give him a smile when he told me about Harry. After I'd been in the senior band at Clapton Congress Hall for a few years, someone invited me along to a Cambridge Heath band practice, which I duly went to. This led to me about thinking about transferring, and of course I asked the Colonel what he thought, and in quiet conversation he felt it would be a good move in terms of scope of brass band playing and repertoire. I did transfer and became a heathen, as we were referred to in those days. The Heath band was doing well, and a while later the Colonel transferred, so I picked up a relationship again. I used to go round to the Colonel's home some evenings, and we would talk about music, composition, composers. He'd been a good friend with George Marshall, another well-known Salvation Army composer, when he was stationed up, and I believe, in South Shields. It was interesting to sit and talk with the Colonel with so much knowledge across music and the Salvation Army. The Colonel composed and arranged many pieces of music, and of course in his days resources were limited and everything was written down on manuscript paper. The first time we actually heard his piece was when a band played it through. Unlike many composers now who are able to play music back through Sibelius software and make adjustments, for the Colonel it was in his head, on the paper, on the piano and then the band. In talking with the Colonel, I always remember him talking about marches, and of course probably his best known is Rosehill, which he wrote in 1946, and it's still found on many programmes today. The Colonel explained to me about the structure of a piece of music: lead in, the start, the middle and the structure, and then the finish. It was mesmerising to sit listening to a master talk about music composition with such passion, as well as his knowledge of course. He said that in hearing some bands play a march, it is like play it as loud as possible all the way through and see how quickly we can get this done. The Colonel was very clear. A march deserves the same attention and interpretation as any other piece of music. He explained that a march is not the same all the way through. There should be light and dark, loud and soft, sections that take people's attentions, a repetitive element so that listeners easily pick up on the tempo can be adjusted, more impact unless it's being actually played on march, which you can't do of course, but it should provide variety for the player and of course bring over a message to the listener and the player of God's word. I think in just listening to the march you will hear and appreciate the differences through each section, the initial impact, the motif as the Colonel calls it, of the G, the B flat and F sharp, which you will hear again through the piece, the soft and light tenor horn and euphonium within section F. There is also a bass solo. This leads to the final section, G, where the band is fully employed. The Colonel's notes state all is easy lines. Unusual to say that, but I believe he's making the point that this should be taken steadily and majestically through to its conclusion. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I chose that recording because it was probably taken at the pace which is most likely what the Colonel would explain to me and how he would want it taken. The speed, it's not too fast, it's not too slow. It allows the band to express what he was writing through his music. So I hope you enjoyed that. At the Heath, the Colonel used to take the band occasionally, usually at special events. He was often invited to take us through Rosehill. You listen to the march, I can hear the Colonel saying that it's not a race and taking it at a steady pace, just as he talked to me about. No mad rush, and allowing the band to fill the hall with the sound of music almost majestically. The Colonel always used to hold the band back in the last section and play at a slightly slower tempo. It is interesting to hear different bands' interpretations of the march. Some bands take it at a louder volume, and whether the bandmaster slows it down in section G. I've also heard some bands speed up in the last section, but it doesn't have the same impact. During the Colonel's time, he produced 162 brass compositions and arrangements, as well as 94 vocal pieces, all credited on the Salvation Army Index. I believe these numbers speak for themselves and truly reflect his abilities, let alone the quality of his music. Although he is world famous, I grew up knowing him as my dad's friend, then my teacher, and then getting to know him and getting closer to him as an adult. I count it as a real blessing and a privilege that I have had such a relationship with the Colonel. And before I close, having started as the administrator at Cambridge Citadel and also starting to come to the meetings regularly, Major John Mott encouraged me to have a blow, which would have been after about 35 years. And I started to come along to practices and eventually played with the band on Sundays and a few events. Unfortunately, I have some health challenges that have put pay to that, but I want to thank the bandmaster for his encouragement, as well as John, and all the band members for making me welcome. I thoroughly enjoyed being part of the band again, albeit for a brief time, but I count it as a privilege to be able to say that I played with Cambridge Citadel, and I think the Colonel will be pretty pleased too.